Okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at an event today that, for billions of people, is the ultimate moment of spiritual ascension, a peaceful transition to the highest companion.
It is.
But when you actually grab the stack of sources we have here, and I mean the whole stack from the most authentic Islamic histories to, the sectarian debates and even the skeptical outsider accounts, the picture gets, it gets complicated.
It really does. It moves from a purely spiritual event to something that looks a lot more like a political thriller, a medical mystery, and a theological crisis all rolled into one.
Exactly. We are doing a deep dive into the death of the Prophet Muhammad in June 632 CE. And honestly, reading through this, I was surprised by how much tension is in the room. We're talking about whispers of poisoning, a chaotic power vacuum, a body left unburied for days, and a community literally pulling apart at the seams before the funeral even happens.
It is a moment of massive dissonance. On one hand, you have the traditional narrative. The prophet completes his mission, gives his final sermon, and passes away with his head in Aisha's lap. It's closure. It's neat.
Right.
But the sources, even the standard, authentic Islamic ones, reveal a reality that was much more chaotic and, frankly, much more human.
So our mission here is to navigate that chaos. We aren't taking sides. We're not here to preach or to debunk. We are just looking at what the sources say, Sunni, Shia, secular, and even the polemical stuff, to figure out what actually went down in Medina.
Or, as we'll find out later, maybe not Medina.
That's a whole other can of worms. So let's start with the basics. The cause of death. If you ask most people, they'd say he got sick, had a fever, and passed away. Natural causes.
And that is the generally accepted view. The sources describe an illness lasting about 13 or 14 days. It starts with these severe headaches, the kind where he has to bind his head tightly with a cloth just to relieve the pressure.
Wow.
Then come the high fever, the fainting spells, and eventually he becomes too weak to lead the public prayers.
But here's where it gets really interesting. In the middle of these descriptions of a standard fever, you have these very specific, very jarring accounts of his pain. I'm looking at Sahih Bukhari here, which, for you listening, is basically the gold standard in the Sunni tradition.
It is.
And Aisha, his wife, is quoted saying she never saw anyone suffer as much pain as the prophet.
It wasn't a gentle drifting away. There are accounts of him dragging his feet on the ground because he couldn't lift them. He is sweating profusely even while shivering. And this intensity of pain, it isn't just a detail. It opens the door to the first major controversy in our stack, the Khaybar poisoning.
Right, this is the cold case element. This part fascinated me because the sources don't just blame a virus, they point back to an assassination attempt. So take us back to 628 CE. This is like 3 or 4 years before he died.
Exactly, the context is crucial. The Muslims had just conquered Khaybar, which was a major Jewish fortress and agricultural center. It was a brutal conflict.
The tensions are high.
It's extremely high. And in the aftermath, a woman named Zainab bint al-Harith prepares a feast for the prophet. A roasted lamb.
And she doesn't just cook it randomly, she actually does reconnaissance, right?
She does. She asks his companions, what part of the sheep does the prophet like best? They tell her he prefers the shoulder, the foreleg. So she takes that specific cut and just loads it with a lethal dose of poison.
And the sources say she had a motive beyond just being on the losing side. This was personal.
Oh, extremely personal. She had lost her father, her uncle, and her husband in the fighting. When she was later caught and interrogated, she didn't deny it. She famously said, if he is a king, I will wrest from him. If he is a prophet, he will be informed.
So it was a test.
A test as much as it was an assassination.
And this is where the miracle comes in, according to the tradition. The meat literally speaks to him.
That's the narrative. He takes a bite, chews it, but something's wrong. He spits it out. He says, this bone tells me it is poisoned. But, and this is the tragic part, his companion, Bishr ibn al-Bara, was eating with him, and Bishr swallowed his meat.
And Bishr becomes the victim.
Some sources say he died instantly. Others say he turned green and died a slow, painful death over the next year. But he died.
But the prophet survives.
He survives. Zainab is executed. But here is the massive question mark in the sources. If he survived it in 628, why are we talking about it in 632?
Because of what he says on his deathbed. This just blew my mind. He's lying there, dying, 4 years later, and he explicitly links his current condition to that meal. He tells Aisha, I still feel the pain caused by the food I ate at Khaybar.
And then comes the line that has caused centuries of debate. And at this time, I feel as if my aorta is being cut from that poison. That is the specific quote from Sahih Bukhari.
Okay, so wait, let's look at this through the skeptic's lens first. They ask, If he's a prophet protected by God, how does the poisoned lamb from 4 years ago kill him, and why didn't God stop him from eating it in the first place?
It's a valid question that the sources really wrestle with. The Sunni apologetic explanation is usually that God did protect him initially. He didn't die instantly like Bishr. They argue the poison lay dormant, or maybe it just permanently weakened his constitution.
So it's a theological explanation.
The theological goal here is to combine two honors: the honor of prophethood and the honor of martyrdom, or shahada.
So it's a feature, not a bug. By having the poison activate years later, he gets to die as a martyr, which is the highest rank in Islam alongside prophethood.
Precisely. It turns a fever into a heroic death. But the skeptics, and certainly the medical historians in our source stack, look at that timeline. 4 years of dormancy for a biological toxin. And they say that is medically implausible.
I mean, that makes sense.
Poisons generally kill you quickly or damage your organs immediately. They argue this narrative might have been constructed later to explain why a man who was supposed to be divinely protected died such an agonizing death.
It elevates the mundane to the meaningful.
Exactly. But there's a darker layer to this aorta comment, isn't there?
Yeah.
This is the aha moment for the polemical sources we looked at.
This is the theological crisis. You have to look at the Quran, specifically Surah 69. I have it right here. It says, and I'm paraphrasing, that if Muhammad were to invent false sayings about God, God would seize him by the right hand and, quote, cut his aorta.
Or life artery. The Arabic word used in the Quran is alawatan. It's a very specific, very violent threat. God is essentially giving a description of how he executes a false prophet.
And then on his deathbed, years later, the prophet says,
I feel as if my aorta is being cut. He uses the word alapar. Now, linguistically, these words al-watin and alapar are often used interchangeably. So if you are a polemicist, a critic of Islam, you look at this and see a divine signature.
Right, they argue it's poetic justice. Like, he died exactly the way the Quran predicted a false prophet would die. He essentially confessed to it.
That is the argument found in sources like Act 17 polemics. They see it as a closed case.
But surely the Islamic scholars are aware of this parallel. I mean, they wouldn't just leave a massive contradiction like that, right?
Oh, they're very aware of it. The standard defense is primarily linguistic. They argue that saying, my life vein is cut, was a common 7th century Arab idiom for extreme pain. It's like us saying, my heart is breaking, or it felt like a knife in my back.
So when I say my heart is breaking, I don't mean my cardiac muscle is literally fracturing.
Exactly. The argument is, he wasn't making a theological admission of guilt, he was just expressing the severity of the pain using a common phrase.
Okay.
And the other defense is that a false prophet would be struck down immediately. God wouldn't let a liar succeed for 23 years, only to kill him with a delayed poison.
It's fascinating that both sides use the exact same texts to argue completely opposite realities.
And that ambiguity is what makes this so complex.
Speaking of ambiguity, let's move from the biology to the room where it happened, the deathbed politics.
Yeah.
Because what happened on that Thursday, the notorious calamity of Thursday, is where the community really starts to fracture.
This is where the train tracks split. If you want to understand the Sunni-Shia divide, the source of tension for 1400 years, you have to understand what happened in this small room on a Thursday afternoon.
Set the scene for us. It's a few days before he dies.
The prophet is in severe pain. He's delirious at times, lucid at others. The room's packed with his closest companions. Suddenly, the prophet asks for writing materials. He says, "Let me write for you a writing after which you will never go astray."
That sounds incredibly important. Never go astray. This is the final will and testament.
You would think so. But here is the kicker. He never gets to write it.
Because Umar ibn al-Khattab stops it.
Right. Umar, who is this powerhouse of a personality, one of the closest companions, intervenes. He tells the people in the room, the prophet is overcome by pain. You have the Quran. The book of Allah is sufficient for us.
Wait, pause there. Imagine the scene. The prophet, the messenger of God, asks for a pen, and his best friend says, "No, we're good. We have the book."
It's shocking. And it causes absolute chaos in the room. The sources say people started shouting. Some were yelling, "Get him the pen, let him write." Others were agreeing with Umar, saying, "Don't burden him, he's in pain." They were arguing so loudly in front of him.
That he kicks them out.
Essentially, he tells them, "Get up and leave me. It is not fitting that you should quarrel in my presence." And the document is never written.
So, what does this all mean? Why would Umar do that?
This is the root of the divide. The Shia perspective is that this was a coup. They believe the prophet intended to write down the name of Ali ibn Abi Talib as his successor. They argue Umar knew this, and he blocked it intentionally to secure power for his own faction.
To them, this is the calamity.
It's the moment that led to everything else.
And the Sunni perspective, how do they defend interfering with a prophet's request?
They view Umar's action as protective. They argue he was shielding the prophet from strain while in agony. Or they view it as an act of ijtihad independent reasoning. Their argument is, if it was truly a divine command, the prophet would have insisted.
He wouldn't have let Umar stop him.
Right. Since he let it go, it must not have been essential.
But the fact remains, the document wasn't written, the ambiguity won. And that ambiguity left a power vacuum that exploded almost the moment he died.
It did. And before we get to that, we have to briefly touch on the internal betrayal theories. We saw some sources, mostly polemical or fringe Shia traditions, that suggest the threat was actual assassination from within.
You mean the theories that Aisha or Hafsa, the daughters of the future caliphs, might have poisoned him?
Yes. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, and I want to be clear, mainstream scholars reject this entirely. It exists in the literature.
The counter evidence is pretty strong though, right? I mean, the Sunni narrative emphasizes his deep love for Aisha.
Absolutely. He chose to stay in her room. He died with his head in her lap. There is that beautiful detail about the siwak, the tooth stick.
Tell us about that.
In his final moments, he sees Aisha's brother enter with a cleaning stick for his teeth. The prophet is too weak to use it, but he looks at it longingly. So Aisha takes it, softens it by chewing on it, and then gently brushes his teeth for him.
That's an incredibly intimate human moment.
It is. And it really counters the idea of an assassination plot by his wife.
So he passes away. It's Monday, June 8th, 632 CE. In any normal society, you'd expect a funeral, mourning, and immediate burial, especially in the desert heat.
But that's not what happened. And this is one of the most surprising facts for people who only know the standard version of history. The prophet's body was left unburied for roughly 3 days.
3 days in the Arabian summer. That seems dangerous, biologically speaking.
It is. And the reason for the delay wasn't religious, it was political.
This brings us to Saqifa.
Right. While his immediate family, Ali, his uncle Abbas, his clan, were inside the house washing the body, the prominent companions, the people who become the leaders of Islam, weren't there. They were at a meeting hall called Saqifa Bani Saida.
Doing what?
Arguing over the throne. The Ansar, the locals of Medina, and the Muhajirin, the migrants from Mecca, were almost coming to blows over who would lead. The sources describe it as incredibly tense. Swords were almost drawn.
This is wild. The prophet is lying dead a few hundred yards away, unburied, and his best friends are in a political shouting match.
A skeptic would say that political power was prioritized over religious duty. A pragmatist, however, might say they were trying to prevent a civil war that would have destroyed the community immediately.
But the optic, the delay, it leads to uncomfortable questions about the body itself.
It does. The traditional view is that the earth does not consume the bodies of prophets. The authentic accounts say the body emitted a sweet fragrance and did not decay.
But we have these other sources in our stack, the polemical ones, and even some obscure traditions mentioned in academic sources. They paint a very different picture.
We do. There are accounts often cited by Christian polemicists of the era, claiming the body began to swell or turn green. There's a medieval Christian legend that claims the body was abandoned because they expected him to resurrect like Jesus. When he didn't, and the body began to rot, they buried him in the middle of the night.
Obviously, those sources are hostile. They want to discredit him.
Of course, they are propaganda, but they highlight the vulnerability of the moment. The fact that there are conflicting accounts at all is a direct result of the political chaos that delayed the burial.
Okay, if you thought that was controversial, hold on. Because this next segment completely flips the table. We're looking at the revisionist history. This comes from academic sources looking at early non-Islamic materials.
This is where we leave the traditional Islamic narrative entirely. We are looking at Christian, Samaritan, and Jewish chronicles that were written right around the time of the events, in the 630s and 640s.
The 11 early sources, and they imply he didn't die in Medina at all.
Several of them suggest he was still alive after 632. They place him at the head of the army invading Palestine.
Leading the conquest of Gaza or Jerusalem.
Yes. There's a chronicle called the Doctrina Jacobi, written very early, which speaks of a prophet appearing among the Saracens who is leading the conquest. It doesn't describe a man dying in a bed in Medina. It describes a warlord at the gates of the Holy Land.
So if this theory is true, the whole deathbed scene in Aisha's room, the final whisper, the fever.
It would all be a later construction. The academic argument is that the early community was apocalyptic. They believed the end times were imminent and that the prophet would lead them to Jerusalem to usher it in.
And when he died, maybe in battle, maybe in Gaza, that didn't fit the narrative.
Exactly. If he died in battle before the end times arrived, it was a theological problem. The prophecy failed. So the theory goes the memory was relocated. Later, historians moved his death back a few years and constructed a peaceful deathbed scene to separate him from the failed apocalyptic expectation.
That is a massive rewrite of history. It's like saying Napoleon didn't die on St. Helena but died at Waterloo and we just changed the story later.
It is, and obviously it's rejected by Muslim scholars. But historically, it's fascinating that the outside world saw him as a military commander, while the internal tradition remembers a peaceful death in Medina.
It just shows how deep the rabbit hole goes. We start with a fever, then poison, then a political coup, and finally a theory that he died leading an army in a completely different country.
It forces us to ask what we actually know. The dissonance between these versions is deafening. You have the Yaqin Institute version, a cosmic, beautiful transition.
And you have the Acts 17 polemics version, a gritty, painful death that fits a pattern of divine punishment.
And the Rational Anthem version, a cold political power struggle where the body is an afterthought.
Precisely. And beneath all these layers, the theological, the political, the polemical, there is a human event, a death.
That's the paradox, isn't it? The human versus the divine. Was this the death of a divinely protected messenger who chose his moment? Or was it the death of a mortal man caught in the crosshairs of biology, politics, and the enemies he made along the way?
The sources don't give us one answer, they give us all of them.
They don't.
It really makes you wonder about that Thursday, that moment with the pen and paper.
It does. It is the ultimate what if of history.
If that sentence had been written, if the ambiguity had been removed,
would we have had the Sunni Shia split? Would we have had 1,400 years of sectarian violence? Or would the history of the Middle East look completely different?
It's a heavy thought. Why, in the final moments of a 23-year mission intended to clarify everything, was ambiguity allowed to win?
That is the question the sources leave us with. And I don't think we'll ever have a definitive answer.
That is certainly something to chew on. You've been listening to The Deep Dive.
Keep asking questions.